Good afternoon, Pnawn Da, and a warm welcome to RTPI Cymru's Welsh Planner live conference, which is being kindly sponsored by Francis Taylor Buildings and Savills. This is a second event of a long week programme looking into how planning and planners can take climate action. My name is Jane Jones and I'm Vice Chair of RTPI Cymru Executive Board, and I'm also a planner at Parc Cenedlaethol Eryri, Snowdonia National Park Authority. This afternoon's webinar will focus on biodiversity's role in addressing climate change. We've got three highly knowledgeable speakers who will each be providing a 15-minute presentation. So time is, obviously we've got quite a lot to put in an hour. Our speakers are Professor Steve Ormerod, who is Professor of Ecology at Cardiff University. Steve will discuss the value of biodiversity to address climate change. Secondly, we have Dr. Paul Jepson, who is the Nature Recovery Lead at Ecosulis Limited. Paul will speak on the value of biodiversity net benefit to address climate change. And lastly, we have Caryn, Roux, who is the Biodiversity Policy Team Leader at Welsh Government, and she'll set out the Welsh Government's approach to biodiversity through the planning system. The full biographies for all three of our speakers are on the conference web pages, which you can find on the RTPI website. If you're during the presentations, if you'd like to ask any questions in respect to them, then please, as you'll note, there's a chat function at the very bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Please feel free to submit questions on there. And at the end of the session, after all three speakers have spoken, we'll hopefully have time to go through those questions and get some answers for you. So time is tight, so without further delay, I'll hand over to our first speaker, which is Professor Steve Ormerod. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for that introduction. I've now just got to find my way to my presentation, if I can do that. And I think you should now be able to see my presentation. Rather presumptuously, I've titled this Planning for Climate Change and Biodiversity. I am not a planner, I am a biologist and ecologist, but what I hope to be able to do in this short presentation is to prompt those of you who are planners and interested in climate change and biodiversity to think about how we can use the planning system through land management to help biodiversity, and in particular catchment biodiversity, to protect river ecosystems that are the ecosystems I know most about. One of the things I think we all need to bear in mind when we address the climate change issue is just what a multifaceted problem it is. We're not only speaking about the ongoing rise in global temperatures, which of course affect us in temperate Wales. We're also concerned about extreme events, in particular rainfall events. And of course, there are various places around the Welsh coast and around the world generally, which are vulnerable to sea level change. A lot of that is thermal expansion of the sea, but it's also being driven partly by the melting of various ice zones across the Earth. Now, of course, the story doesn't stop there, because climate change problems also interact with a whole range of other environmental issues. In the systems I'm interested in, freshwater systems, we've recently shown, for example, how microplastics are an increasingly widespread problem, and the discharge of wastewater through wastewater treatment works under high floods is just one example of the problems that climate change could bring to some of the other problems that we have to deal with. And one of the really key things is that as we look into the future, even though there is action being precipitated around the world to try and get on top of the climate change problem, no matter if we could reach some of the lowest emission scenarios possible, this blue line here, we are inevitably looking at further warming in the atmosphere, and also because of the way heat is now being stored in the marine environment, that heat will continue to come out and maintain warming trends in the atmosphere. Now that essentially means that we have, I think, an array of different options. Mitigation, where we try and prevent the discharge of greenhouse gases, but in particular human behaviour change and adaptation, where we have to prepare the systems we care about for what will be inevitable warming circumstances, inevitable changes in the global hydrological cycle. So some of the broad adaptations we have in ecological terms are about assessing risk to sensitive species and ecosystems, protecting those same sensitive units, trying to increase resilience in populations, communities, ecosystems, and the processes that we depend on from them, restoring connectivity among systems so that organisms can move, and reducing other stresses that exacerbate climate change impacts. And I'm going to pick on a couple of those today. I don't have time to go through all of them. I will be demonstrating the principles using river organisms. These are the organisms that I've been working with for the last 40 years. They are important in aggregate for a whole range of different things, maintaining biological diversity, increasing fish production, purifying water. But they are very sensitive to climate change, partly because the freshwater environment is increasing in temperature, flow patterns are changing, oxygen concentrations are changing because streams and rivers are getting warmer, and these are mostly organisms that depend on their environment for their own body temperature. They can't regulate their own temperature and hence are sensitive. Now, in fact, our own work on climate change goes back now about 30 years. And back in 2001, we started to show that because of events like the North Atlantic Oscillation, these big climate systems in the North Atlantic, the stability of freshwater communities was changing quite substantially. By the time 2005 came along, we illustrated how the numbers of invertebrates in Welsh streams and rivers were declining as they became warmer. And that trend, it seems, is continuing to this day. But we've been particularly interested in looking into how things like the management of river catchments, by the way we alter what's in the streamside zone, the riparian zone, or the whole catchment, could give us some kind of opportunity to protect the freshwater ecosystems downstream. If you take the example of riparian woodlands, for example, we know that different streams warm up to a different extent depending on the drainage patterns around them. These numbers here are the measures of the rapidity, the slope with which water temperature increases with air temperature. And you'll see that the numbers are quite low for choke streams, which are damped by groundwater. But if we plant or if we encourage or restore riparian broadleaves alongside Welsh streams, they have an effect on damping stream temperature, which is almost as big as the groundwater effects that come out of choke streams in southeastern England. Other effects go beyond that thermal damping, and we know, for example, that organisms in rivers, their whole economy and energy is dependent on the amount of leaf litter that falls annually into the river environment. And this very complicated figure essentially shows that as the amount of water going through Welsh streams increases, so leaf litter is exported more rapidly downstream. So in other words, we lose that leaf litter. But if we have deciduous trees in the riparian zone, they put enough leaf litter into the stream to offset that negative effect that increased discharge brings. We know that this is important in maintaining the biomass of organisms in the river. Things like brown trout can do very well if we have deciduous woodlands or buffers in the riparian zone. And if you look at the numbers down here, that's the biomass of invertebrates in streams in different kinds of river catchments and the best possible circumstances for maintaining production or where we have deciduous trees in the riparian zone. Our data over 40 years, in fact, shows that here are different measures of resilience, either the functional variability in stream function, the resilience of stream invertebrate abundance, and the most resilient options come where we have semi-natural or natural broadleaf vegetation protecting our streams and rivers. So as a question, therefore, around what planning can do to encourage the right kinds of land uses, what are the options available to us? Markets for ecosystem services to incentivise the right kind of actions, appropriate agri-environment, building nature-based solutions, rewilding, better regulation. Perhaps we should change the way we think about landscape designations. And at the same time, we've got to think about how we use our very visionary legislation in Wales, Wellbeing of Future Generations Acts, the Environment and Planning Acts, to encourage the right kind of actions. I want to turn now to one other example about the way we can protect and adapt stream and river environments to climate change, and that's by mitigating or preventing some of the other stresses with which climate change interacts. And we, with colleagues, have been looking at very long-term trends in the stream and river environment in Britain. And what we're aware of is that as we have increasingly been on top of preventing at least some discharges coming from wastewater treatment works, then the evidence is, in particular in urban rivers, there has been recovery from past sanitary pollution problems of the past. In Wales, that is very clear. It's being debated in England at the moment, but the evidence we have shows that there has been some improvement, at least so far. And what we can see here is that, looking back over the last 20 years or so, organisms that are tolerant to pollution have been declining. Organisms that like well oxygenated, fast flowing conditions in urban rivers have been increasing. And what we think is happening is that although there has been warming, there is a debt that we are accumulating around the effects of temperature. That debt is being offset because we have been on top of controlling organic pollution. And at the moment, the net benefit is one where it seems we are at least keeping pace with preventing problems becoming worse. And we've got laboratory data to show, for example, where we clean up pollution from rivers, then organisms in rivers are able to tolerate warmer conditions. More oxygen in the river mean that more oxygen-loving insects can colonize rivers, they can maintain healthy processes, but that effect is aided, the tolerance to warming is aided where we control pollution. So just to come to some kind of summary from all of this inside my 15 minutes is that freshwater biodiversity just gives us one set of examples about the problems faced by biodiversity from climate change, but we do have options in our armoury to adapt those systems if we can take them. And in fact, we could combine mitigation, for example, by expanding woodland cover in appropriate areas with adaptation. We've got options like better regulation, improved catchment management, innovating and incentivising sensitive land management, nature-based solutions, reducing other stresses. And I would like to hear, I think, from people in the audience about how planning can help that process. We still have risks and threats that are emerging, both in rural and urban rivers. We know there are problems, but the need to act now is urgent, given the lead time that some of the implementation will require to get some of these adaptation schemes off the ground. At which point I will bring my presentation to an end, Jane, and hand over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Steve, for that. That's really quite interesting. I'm sure that people have questions to raise towards the end of that. Our next speaker is Dr. Paul Jepson, and Paul will speak on the value of biodiversity net benefits to address climate change. And just before Paul starts, if there's any tweeters out there I did forget to mention before, then please use the hashtag Wales Plan Live 2020. Over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Well, we can't hear you. Your mic's
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I beg your pardon, sorry, and I need to just do this as well. So, give me a second. Good. So I hope everybody can see that slide, and thanks again for this opportunity to present on themes of climate change and biodiversity. And I hope this story, this presentation will complement and build on what Steve has just had to say. I think we realise that there's been some pretty massive developments in Welsh policy. The declaration of the climate and nature emergency, and the publication of the Environment Wales Act. And forgive me for putting some small text up on the slide, but I would. It is really worth just reflecting a moment on how the Environment Wales Act has defined sustainable management of natural resources. You'll actually see that the word biodiversity doesn't appear in this definition, and there's a very strong focus on ecosystems and the resilience of recovering the resilience of ecosystems. For me, I think when I think about this link between climate change and biodiversity, or climate change and ecosystems, I think it's important to understand that for me they're fundamentally quite different policy issues, and then they're quite different issues for planning, albeit that they are linked. The climate crisis is fundamentally an issue of environmental pollution, the pollution of the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. Whereas the nature crisis, or the biodiversity crisis, as we're sometimes hearing it called now, is increasingly realised to be a problem of the loss of ecosystem function. So one is an issue of pollution, and one is an issue of the loss of function. And historically, both planning and policy have been, and investments actually, have been quite adept at developing planning policy instruments to deal with the issue of pollution. But a key message of my talk is that we are in the infancy, in the early days of policy to deal with the loss of ecosystem function, and in particular, the recovery of ecosystem function. Now, when we're looking at solving the climate crisis or climate policy, ecosystem function is increasingly seen as a fundamental part of the solution. You may have come across this term, natural climate solutions. So if we're looking at this slide I've just put up on the screen, we've got greenhouse gases being released by industry, housing, planes, and also by agriculture. And then the ecosystem functions are helping to sequester that carbon, to pull down some of the carbon out of the atmosphere, almost acting like a giant scrubber, if you like, to scrubbing the pollution out of the atmosphere. And that's what we call the climate mitigation piece. Then on the other side, we have climate adaptation. I think we all realise that we're not going to stop climate change, that we need to learn to live with it and adapt our planning and our societies to do that. And here ecosystem functions are really quite important. We're seeing them in the UK, natural flood management, not yet in the UK, thankfully, and in Wales, but elsewhere in Europe, the role of ecosystem functions in solutions to managing catastrophic wildfires. But we are really rather just focusing on the mitigation piece at the moment. I think this is one of my messages from this talk. And actually a number of new technology reforestation companies are starting to emerge, which are offering planners, if you like, and politicians, quite a simple solution to this. The idea that we can, they can model carbon sequestration rates, do tree planting, and sell carbon credits, or either sell them directly to companies. And this is creating a planning demand, I suppose, for tree planting or afforestation sites. There is ecologists are becoming increasingly worried about this solution, if you like, because it's a sort of simple linear logic that appeals to politicians, citizens, people like tree companies, and also companies and investors. However, a sole focus on tree planting and the ecosystem service, the function that ecosystems provide of sequestering carbon, is creating worries that this could have cascading effects through our already degraded ecosystems. I think the key point here is that the climate and nature emergency, they're both Earth system issues. And because of that, we really need a systems approach. Interestingly, so, this idea that high level policy demands a system approach, when we do look at some of the, or when we look at the narratives, if you like, in the planning policy for Wales and the directives, the guidelines coming from that, it's all systems languages. We want a resilient Wales, we want functioning ecosystems, we want health that recognise the limits of the global environment. It's important that biodiversity and ecosystem resilient considerations are taken into account. I think this is significant, is that biodiversity and ecosystem resilience are becoming two separate discourses or topics of planning, and I'll come to that in a moment. However, and with respect to the chief planner here, often when we're thinking about how to deliver ecosystem functioning planning or ecosystem resilience, we come back to the instruments, the logics of biodiversity policy. Something I think it's important to recognise here is that biodiversity as a policy construct, and indeed a scientific construct, is a 1980s construct. It comes out of the worldviews and the thinkings and concerns of that era. It embodies a protectionist worldview, and it often, this is changing a bit, has viewed biodiversity conservation as an end in itself. In planning, it's often reduced ecosystems to units of either species, the populations of species like great crested newts, or habitats. Priority habitats, for instance, is a common language. And it's underpinned by quite a linear pressure state response policy design. We can take pressures on, the state of nature will respond in a better way. And this has always enabled strong protective nature laws and planning laws. But I'm sure as many of us are involved, I'm not massively involved in planning, no. It's also introduced incredible complexity, cost, friction, inflexibility, and maybe frustration into the planning system. So another message, although I'm supposed to be talking about biodiversity, is one message, I think something we're beginning to be aware of, is that the planning or the policy instruments, if we like, for biodiversity, the policy mechanism instruments, they're not really fit for purpose when it comes to restoring and recovering ecosystem resilience and the functions we need to link biodiversity, ecosystems, and climate change together. Now, some of you may be aware of this term rewilding, and I know it has a particular media, profile and controversy. But rewilding is actually a label which is given to being assigned or has been taken up by a new scientific discourse, which is sort of capturing advances in the science of ecology. There's been a huge rise of academic articles since 2010. As you can see, 2020, the number of academic articles has already surpassed that in 2018. Really sort of framework scientific papers coming out. I've just published a book sort of bringing together the science or communicating the science in a more popular format. I think the point here is that what we're seeing in terms of the science of ecosystem recovery and the science of ecosystem resilience, that's starting to settle now. There's these frameworks for what could create policy responses to it. And it's starting to formulate into a series of practical and applied principles to guide action. But the policy is not yet there. We're only at the very beginnings of discussing or frameworks for policy to support and enable ecosystem resilience. And maybe this is just, I just put this in as I hope a useful slide to sort of just try and get a sense of the difference between these new discourses, the discourses of biodiversity and ecosystem resilience, and how they're operationalized in planning policy. So biodiversity is often managing nature to achieve prescribed states, and that enables this discourse of biodiversity net gain, where we take habitat types as a proxy for ecosystems, and these habitat types, ancient woodland, neutral grasslands or whatever, these different habitat types can be specified, mapped and recreated. And they can be converted to net gain units and biodiversity credits, which then can guide biodiversity provisioning, planning and so forth. The concept of ecosystem recovery is different because it's about interactions, and it's about restoring ecological or interactions within the ecosystems and allowing the ecosystems in part to shape their future trajectories. So this creates uncertainty and dynamism in the system. And then whereas biodiversity has this heritage of protection, this new narrative is more flexible and innovative. It's about working with restored natural forces and those of society and economy to create or design nature-based solutions. So the sort of things protect and restore, they're working in tandem now, but need different and integrated policy approach. How do we get there? And I think this is one of the challenges maybe of our times, to think about how we design and develop this new planning and policy framework for ecosystem recovery. As always, as seems to be the case, the Dutch are 20 years ahead of us. And one of the things they did back in the 1980s, somewhat by accident, they created spaces of innovation, spaces or zones where existing policies could be relaxed. They used public competitions for nature-based solution approaches. They created demonstration projects to engage others with new ideas, and to do that bit about reconnecting nature or biodiversity conservation with cultural trends. And one of the great case studies of this is the Gelderse port in Nijmegen, which is a river project where agricultural lands behind the winter dikes were repurposed, or the old river system, braiding and so forth, was recreated. And they created a 5,000 hectare new natural asset from this, and also through this enabled processes of policy development and institutional transition. And this has generated enormous planning gain for the city of Nijmegen and the wider region. Ecosystem resilience has restored. There's been these exciting kickbacks of biodiversity, which is sort of pushing this idea that biodiversity is an emergent property of ecological recovery, solve the supply of aggregates, it's developed new leisure opportunities, re-energise the rural economy, and so forth. So in summary, restoring ecosystem function and resilience, in my view, is a cost-effective means to address both climate change and the biodiversity crisis. Biodiversity and ecosystem resilience, from a policy perspective, are not quite the same, and we need new regulations and guidance recovering ecosystem function and resilience. And a step towards this may be to create spaces of nature innovation to inform new planning policy that will deliver environmental net gain. As I showed you, I think that Gelderse port is a great example of environmental net gain. And also the well-being benefits, which are, of course, in the other new Act. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Paul. That was very interesting, especially in terms of what the Dutch are doing in respect to biodiversity. And the final speaker is Caryn Roux, who will be setting out the Welsh Government's approach to biodiversity through the planning system. So over to you, Caryn. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for asking me to speak this afternoon. As you can see, I'm going to be talking about our approach to biodiversity through the planning system and focusing on net benefit for biodiversity. Thank you to both Steve and to Paul for introducing the subject. And Paul, I think you've thrown down some challenges there for us to respond to, and I hope that we are, at least in part, starting to respond to those. So just to run you through the content of what I'm going to talk about very quickly. So the law, which again Paul introduced very helpfully in terms of our new framework that we have and how that links then to planning policy. what is it that we need to do differently? And again, I think we've been quite clearly explained that we do need to do things differently. And what outcomes are that we want to see for the net benefit for biodiversity approach? And then just to introduce you to some draft definition and principles that we've been working on over the last year. And finally, how you can get involved if you'd like to. So to start off with then, just to talk very briefly about the Welsh legislative framework, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with. But in terms of the context for the Net Benefit for Biodiversity policy, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act puts the long-term perspective on things. We must be thinking about how we are looking at biodiversity and ecosystems for the long term. And then the Environment Wales Act puts into place the sustainable management of natural resources, again looking at long-term benefits for future generations, but the objective of which is to maintain and enhance resilient ecosystems. And finally, the Planning Act, which aims to ensure we put the right thing in the right place, and specifically we have the National Development Framework coming up, which will help us to do that. Moving on then, just to look a bit more closely at WFG and the clear link that there is between biodiversity and healthy functioning ecosystems. So the Resilient Wales Goal, which people sometimes misinterpret as being about social and economic resilience, is all about biodiversity and linking that to healthy functioning ecosystems. And all of that then underpins the rest of the goals that we have. And then part one of the Environment Wales Act, just in a bit more detail. The sustainable management of natural resources, as I said, is all about maintaining and enhancing the resilience of our ecosystems and the benefits that they provide. And then built into that, to help us to achieve the resilience of our ecosystems, we have some attributes which are set out in the law, and they look at diversity, connectivity, extent and condition, and all of those four together add up to making those ecosystems more adaptable, either for climate change, for species movement, or for flood resilience, or for many other benefits that provides us. So if we look at just one of those as an example, diversity within the Act can mean biodiversity, or it can mean structural diversity, and I think genetic diversity is set out in the Act as well. But the point is that it's not just biodiversity, it's many types of diversity. But if we look at just one example, if you look at a monoculture woodland, you have not much diversity of structure and not much diversity of species. If we add in an understory, we have more diversity of structure, but a little bit more diversity. And then if we look at a native woodland or a semi-natural woodland, then we have diversity of structure and diversity of species, diversity of niches, diversity of functions, and essentially we're going from the least resilient then down to the most resilient. So the Act puts those linkages in place for us. It also puts in place a Section 6 biodiversity and resilience of ecosystems duty. Again, linking those two things together. So public authorities must, and this does include planning authorities specifically, must seek to maintain and enhance biodiversity in the exercise of functions, and in so doing, promote the resilience of ecosystems so far as consistent with the proper exercise of those functions. So what that is saying is, yes, we must indeed maintain and enhance biodiversity, not only for its own sake, but because of the resilience of ecosystems which it underpins. And it's about how functions are exercised. So particularly when we're looking at planning or development, it's not seeking to prevent development per se, but it's how we look at planning control and development control. So that's then been translated into planning policy, and PPW10 was quite emphatic in setting out how the planning system can contribute to improving resilience of ecosystems, halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity, maintaining and enhancing green infrastructure, which helps to do both of those things, and also in delivering a net benefit for biodiversity. But, well, as Paul rightly said, we still need to develop much of the policy underneath those ambitions. In a bit more detail, just looking at the things set out in the Environment Act. So we're looking at, for example, resilient ecological networks. That will play into the National Development Framework coming up and help us to look at the spatial delivery of those resilient ecological networks in the planning framework. And then looking at the Section 6 biodiversity duty, that is looked at delivering that better through securing a net benefit for biodiversity. And last year we had a letter from the Chief Planner to all heads of planning, which added some authority to that direction. So it set out a bit more information about how we could look at biodiversity and ecosystem functioning, but also stated that if we can't do those things, it will be necessary to refuse permission. So coming out from that letter, we have a planning and biodiversity forum under the Nature Recovery Action Plan. And within that, we set up a task and finish group to have a look at net benefit for biodiversity and how that could be delivered and how we can provide some further guidance for that. So what do we need to do first? First of all, we need to think a bit differently. I think we were, again, previous speakers have pointed out how, we've done things previously, but the way we've been doing things, the way we've been delivering planning, the way we've been delivering our agri-environment systems, much of the way we work currently is leading to a loss in biodiversity. And despite our best intentions and our best endeavours through conservation action, that loss is declining. And we now know, and last week there was the release of the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which set out that the 20 targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity have all been failed, only 6 of them being partly achieved. And the reason for most of that is because we need to think differently, we need to do things differently. We have to start thinking like an ecosystem, so thinking about the whole and not just the parts, but we also have to put ourselves into that ecosystem. We can no longer think that we can do things to our ecosystems which won't affect us or won't affect biodiversity, and we'll be able to offset them. So one of our starting positions was then that we need to start thinking about how we can keep much of what we already have and keep it intact. We've heard a lot about ecosystem complexity from Steve and how difficult that is to deal with, and how those complex ecosystems can help us adapt to climate change and so many of the other benefits, flood defence, for example. So relating that to the Section 6 duty, we need to start thinking about maintaining and enhancing, not damaging and mitigating. Recreating complex ecosystems, which we've always tried to do in the past. I think, Paul, you related that to biodiversity conservation rather than ecosystem resilience. Trying to recreate like-for-like complex ecosystems is difficult, incredibly expensive, and actually impossible to achieve in any kind of meaningful time frame. And apart from that, if we're looking at offsetting benefits onto other sites, we have finite land available to keep on doing that. However, having said all that, we do need to recognise that development, and as I said, we're not seeking to prevent all development. We need a pragmatic approach to recognise that some development will result in situ loss of some biodiversity. I've put up the graphic there for the stepwise process. I'm not going to talk in great detail about that now, but just to say that we need to concentrate our effort on avoiding, minimising, and going to compensation as the last resort. So just to quickly look at the kinds of outcomes we're looking for a principles approach. Apologies, some of these need to click through. So we're looking for developments that maintain and enhance biodiversity and ecosystem resilience on site first. We're looking for developments that improve and connect up ecosystems beyond their boundaries, developments that work with nature and deliver nature-based solutions, and developments that are good for biodiversity and therefore are also good for people. They're healthy, good for well-being, and they deliver multiple benefits. And we're looking at taking a principles approach to this. So we've drafted a definition. So the concept that development should leave biodiversity in a better state than before, which I think will be familiar to the biodiversity net gain definition. But just to add to that, we want to secure long-term, measurable and demonstrable benefit, primarily on site. And as I say, this is a draft definition, so we'll be looking at the wording. It will work through but expand the stepwise process as set out in PPW 10. And just to reiterate, it's not seeking to prevent development, but to ensure that development works with nature. And some of the draft principles that we've started with, but we'll also throw up issues to work through, no doubt, that we want to apply this approach to all developments. I know that's going to present some difficulties and challenges, but that's the ambition. We want it to apply to biodiversity in its widest sense. So we're looking at ecosystem complexity. Soil biodiversity is an absolute, underpins some of those ecosystems that provide the benefits we have. And soil biodiversity is best kept by keeping it in situ in the first instance. So I say the aim is to keep and drive biodiversity benefits on site first. Again, maintain and enhance, not damage and mitigate, but also it's not offsetting. Aims to connect developments to its surroundings and wider through applying those DECA attributes, diversity, extent, connectivity and condition set out in the Act. And it's a proactive process to look for and secure enhancement opportunities. So we need creativity and an element of flexibility. Quick, I know I'm running out of time, so very quick notes on a metric. We recognise that there is a method of measuring whether a net benefit biodiversity has been achieved will be required. However, we have quite a lot of misgivings about metrics. They can be a very blunt tool. It's very difficult to apply a one-size-fits-all solution to a highly complex system, and it works much better for habitats than for species. There are lots of mechanisms and measures that we might be able to use. Checklists, NRW are working on guidance and indicators for resilience attributes. So thinking that we probably do need a measure, we would want that to be applied in the context of this principles approach. So it will provide a monitoring framework and help to create a level playing field for developers, but it will still require expert judgment to ensure that the approach is being achieved. So just to wrap up then, as I said, we've been working on this draft set of principles over the last year. We are talking to our task and finish group at the moment, and also talking to NRW. And we will be coming out for consultation over the next few months. And the aim is that that will be working its way into PPW clarifications either through 11 or 12 in the next year. You can get involved, or you can get in touch with myself or with Siobhan Wiltshire through the Nature Recovery Action Plan, Biodiversity and Planning Forum, or through the consultation. And we look forward to talking with you further about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Caryn, for an excellent presentation. Certainly very interesting to see that that there's going to be a new consultation coming out soon. It's something that certainly on the back of the letter that we got from Chief Planning Officer in respect to securing biodiversity enhancements, that certainly that's what sort of one question I was going to raise is the fact is that obviously there are a lot of local planning authorities that we're struggling with resources as it is, and sort of exactly how do we go about actually securing those enhancements, and at what level is Welsh Government expecting that to happen. So the fact that the consultation is coming out is obviously much celebrated, as it were, because I think there'll be sort of lots of answer questions and answers raised in that respect. So I think, have we got all our presenters together now? Is Paul Jepson there? We've had some questions.
I am still here, but I can't see anybody.
Right, I don't know whether Adam is able to help with that at all. But we've had some questions, and probably seeing as Steve has been quiet for some time, I've got a question for yourself, Steve, and the question is, does the restoration of the riparian zone of rivers improve flood events downstream too?
Thank you, Jane, for that question. And let me just build a little bit on what we've just heard from Caryn, which is essentially a set of processes which are linked to development. And I think quite a lot of the issues we have to address around biodiversity decline in the face of climate change are at quite a substantial scale. And I think it's a bit of a challenge for the planning system to address the scale of the issues that we have to address, rather than being linked to specific development in specific locations. And I think that the restoration of semi-natural habitats at scale is one that takes us into a space where we're thinking about scale-related large responses that can deliver a whole set of different objectives. And I was talking specifically about the protection of river environments by making processes resilient. And there is the capacity here also to offset things like the risk of flooding. What we understand so far is that there are some flood events, and they are becoming larger because of climate change, that no land use changes will protect us against, because these are dramatically large changes that we're facing. But certainly from the perspectives of smaller floods, nature-based solutions delivered by the expansion of woodlands in riparian zones and other key areas in catchment is one of the key ways we've got to at least address some of the climate change pressures we face.
Right. Thanks very much, Steve. I don't know whether any other Paul or Caryn, if you've got anything further to add to that. No.
Just on this question of riparian zones, in this sort of new language, if you like, or new framing of ecological recovery, these are often, on the nature-based solution, it's often more thought in terms of, rather than using riparian zones, focusing on the restoration of washlands. So that example I gave you of the Geldersay port was the restoration of a river washland, these broader areas which it washes across. And those can be designed as new natural assets to create those multiple benefits I was talking about, where the recovery of riparian zones, if we're thinking about a long, a band along a river, that has a has some benefit, but it can have a more reduced sort of social ecological benefit.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, Steve, you.
Well, maybe you want to take the question. Paul and I having, other than Paul and I having a debate.
But there's another question for Paul. I don't know, Paul, can you hear me okay? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fine, thank you.
Right. Okay. The question is: could developers, via contributions, buy into strategic planned green infrastructure that incorporates biodiversity net gain via biodiversity credits? That way, a strategic scale approach could assist with a collaborative, coordinated approach with key organisations such as Wildlife Trust and local authorities, as well as the public, and potentially achieve bigger wins.
So absolutely is the question for that, and I'm actually doing some work in Gloucestershire just along that theme. And I think one of the ways is how we think of net gain and net gain credits. And I think Claire mentioned the notion of like to like. We lose one habitat and we create another habitat. If you break out of that and say, let's create strategic new natural assets, and then we have a facility where developers credits can be aggregated and then strategically invested, that gives us the opportunity to do some things more exciting. But at the moment, I'm only aware of two, and they're not very well developed. You sort of need a special purpose vehicle in the middle to be able to aggregate the contributions from developers who've had a net impact on habitats or biodiversity. So I think the question is, in my view, that's the way we need to go. But it comes back to my point of having the right policy mechanisms and frameworks to be able to do that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Paul.
Can I add to that?
Sorry? Yeah, absolutely.
Just to say that that is certainly within the principles. It's within the sort of compensatory measures, but we're very clear within the draft principles as we have them at the moment that we work through the stepwise process, so that we're looking at on-site benefits first, and that isn't necessarily instead recreating like-for-like habitats, but that certainly an option for sort of compensatory measures at the end of that process would certainly be looking at something like that. And there's a number of things we can consider in terms of levies, habitat banking, strategic, planned mechanisms, as we've mentioned. But one thing we really don't want to look at is purchasing credits as a sort of, let's just carry on business as usual.
Thanks very much, Caryn, for that. And then actually, Caryn, I've actually got a question for yourself that's come through. And it's: the Environment Act places a duty on community and town councils to report on their contribution to biodiversity actions annually. How can this be harnessed to bring a collective improvement rather than just an account of individual initiatives?
Oh, good question. Yes, it does. Actually, it's every 3 years. So they had to report at the end of last year, unless you're thinking about the WFG report. But under Section 6 biodiversity duty, they need to report every 3 years. So the next one will be due at the end of 2022. We are looking this year at doing some evaluation as to how the duty has been achieved thus far, so over the last 3 years. And I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that people are still looking at is what they can do, thinking about small species or habitat actions when, yes, we need to be looking at aggregating those up. We are just about to publish the refreshed Nature Recovery Action Plan, which sets out our priorities for resilient ecological networks. So that is something we want to then help town community councils, planning authorities to deliver those resilient ecological networks, and that will be set out also in the NDF. So there's some work coming on that.
Right. Thanks very much for that. And there's just one more question for yourself, I think it is, Caryn. So it's put to clarify, if a development does not have a direct impact on biodiversity, the clarification letter expects the developer to still provide enhancements. This is very different to how other impacts are dealt with, but is the justification the legal requirement?
Well, we believe so, yes, that it's under the Section 6 biodiversity duty is to maintain and enhance. So that is clear under the legislation, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much for that. I don't think we've had any other questions at all. And we are approaching 3 o'clock and at the end of the webinar. So, so certainly on behalf of RTPI Cymru, thank you very much to Steve, to Paul and to Caryn for the presentations. It's certainly been a very sort of interesting and informative session, and certainly I'm going to be taking a lot away in terms of, obviously this will be a planner in terms of sort of the bigger picture in terms of what we can do sort of in terms of developments and going into the future. So a big thank you to yourselves. I'd like to also thank Savills and Francis Taylor Buildings, who have been sponsoring the event for this week. Just to let delegates know that there will be a recording of this session available on the RTPI's YouTube channel, where some of the slides from the presentation will be able to be reviewed on that if required. The actual presentations won't be emailed out separately at all. They're available on the YouTube channel. But also thank you very much indeed to all the delegates that have joined us today. And I hope you've found the actual session very, very useful indeed. Thank you very much indeed.